From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you, and here's today's lineup. On board to talk about the cattle markets from Oklahoma State University, Derrell Peel. Derrell will discuss the positive moves in both the fed cattle and boxed beef trades last week, and he'll take a closer look at the serious drought conditions shaping up in the western U.S., now building up as well in the Central Plains, and the possible implications for the markets, as well as you individual producers' management decisions. Jeff Wickman has our second segment today with K-State's Sarah Lancaster discussing weed management in pastures. And Jeff has this week's 4-H segment further on. K-State's Beth Hinshaw will talk about community service projects. It's all here on Agriculture Today.
Have you ever wondered why livestock producers burn Kansas pasture? Here's the deal. Controlled burning helps preserve the prairie and allows every bite feeder cattle eat to be the most nutritious. National Wildlife and Parks also feel it is a necessity to help with wildlife populations.
So the next time you see a Kansas pasture burning, know it's for the good of our wildlife, our prairie, and our livestock. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Welcome once again to another Agriculture Today. Glad to be back with you. And we bring in now, for the look at the cattle markets, Derrell Peel, livestock economist out of Oklahoma State University. Derrell joins us regularly. And getting your thoughts on the trades this past week, Derrell. On the fed cattle side, 2 weeks in a row of improved prices. So that's certainly encouraging.
Yeah, it took us about 6 weeks to break out of the doldrums, I guess, that we were in, but we've finally seen this fed cattle market advance pretty sharply the last 2 weeks and kind of get back on track to, sort of what we've been looking for all spring. We're coming closer to bringing the cash fed cattle prices in line with where the April futures have been for a while, and we've got even more optimism built into that June contract at this point. So we'll see what happens from here.
And the feeder cattle market, what's your read on that?
Still pretty strong. We did see, feeder cattle markets, at least in Oklahoma, back off just a little bit 2 weeks ago. This past week, they bounced back. Obviously, the futures market, to the extent that the cash market takes its cue from that, has had lots of challenges here, particularly this past week with the grain market impacts. But in general, I think the lightweight, the grazing type cattle are still pretty strong. And if you look at those prices, there's optimism, I think, for summer grazing programs. The bigger feeder cattle are going to continue to try to sort of incorporate the implications of this feed market situation that we're in.
And we want to circle back to that in just a second. But what is fueling this most recent improvement in prices? Is it in part what we see happening in the boxed beef trade?
It is. It's a combination, I think, of supply and demand factors, but probably the demand side continues strong. After a somewhat counter-seasonal run-up in boxed beef in January into February, we did pull back a little bit briefly, and then we've taken off again in a more seasonal way with a lot of strength in these boxed beef prices. And in fact, if you look at across all the meats, beef, pork, and poultry prices are all at the wholesale level running very strong. And so I think, demand in general is going strong. Obviously, we got another round of stimulus payments. That's helping, no doubt. And so demand side is definitely helping to pull these cattle markets ahead a little bit.
And the hope is that momentum will continue as we see more opening up in our economies, more folks reportedly heading back to the restaurants, and dine out is happening at a more brisk pace. So we may just be on the front edge of this continued improvement?
I really think so. Again, I think there's a fair amount of optimism built into the general economy just from the standpoint that we are making progress with vaccine rollout and moving forward with reopening the economy. From a beef standpoint specifically, as we move into April here, we're really setting up the seasonal demand that's associated with, coming grilling season. A lot of that wholesale buying is going to take place in April and early May, getting ready for Memorial Day weekend. So a combination of both the retail grocery demand, if you will, from that standpoint, as well as continued progress on the food service side is really helping to support these wholesale meat markets.
Coming back, though, to something you mentioned, that is feed costs. And Normally, when the USDA puts out its planting intentions report, as it did last week, that report might have at most a minor influence on the cattle markets. But given that the planting numbers for feed grains were considerably lower than anticipated, is this report a bit different in terms of its impact on the cattle trades?
Well, it's going to continue to be a challenge for sure. You know, we've had such a strong run-up in crop prices for about the last 8 months, and that's beginning to be reflected in these, I shouldn't say beginning, it's certainly being reflected in these feedlot cost of gain. There'll be more of that to come, but this report then added more to the expectation that there's really no end in sight here in terms of these stronger grain prices, both from a demand standpoint, which still looks pretty firm, as well as from relatively tight supplies. And this planting intentions report in particular, coming in so much less than trade expectations, it leaves some questions because there's some acres, if you will, sort of unaccounted for. And the question, I think, now is sort of where will, will those acres stay out of production? Will they come back into production? Exactly in what crops? And obviously planting conditions and weather is going to have a big impact here in the next 2 months over exactly where we get set up. But the bottom line is it looks like we're going to continue to see feed cost challenges that will have an impact on the cattle markets.
And it does come back to basically a question of, can beef demand outrace increased production costs? Is that the essence of it?
Well, to some extent, that's right. I mean, obviously, the feeder cattle market is the most vulnerable to high feed prices, all else being equal. But all else in this case is largely fed cattle prices. So if fed cattle prices continue to strengthen, that can help pull the whole thing ahead, even with those feed market impacts into the feeder cattle market side. The other thing that's kind of interesting that's sort of developed now is that with these corn prices advancing as much and as fast as they have, they've actually kind of caught up to wheat prices to the point where feedlots may begin to think about switching out some feed ingredients. Mm-hmm. And so with a wheat harvest coming on, a winter wheat harvest coming on here in May and June, we may see potentially see some switching of feedlot rations to help moderate a little bit some of those higher corn prices.
As well as things seem to be setting up in the cattle markets, though, Derrell, there is this caveat we want to spend the rest of our time on. You actually put an article together on this very topic recently, and it's a good look at what's going on with our drought situation, which has been rather notable in the western U.S. and is perhaps now creeping into the Central Plains as well. Just your general take on where we're at with this drought worry and what it means to the markets.
Springtime droughts really concern me because you can get into so much more serious conditions right away. I don't know if there's such a thing as a typical kind of a drought, but you think of droughts as something that kind of develops over the heat of the summer and is more of an issue in late summer and into the fall and so on. Starting the year as dry as we are with as much widespread drought conditions as we have right now sets up the potential that we could see impacts, particularly if this drought does advance a little bit farther east in some areas. The Dakotas are very dry. Parts of Texas are very dry. And those are areas that have a lot of cattle in them. And so if we see, this real pronounced impact on early spring forage growth, that could translate into, some forced changes in cattle production in those regions that could have significant market impacts.
Let's talk more about that. And in fact, you in the article note that we're at our highest level or the worst drought since 2014 in these regions. So that is of great concern, obviously. Individual producers need to be, you think, weighing where they're at and what potentially can happen with a drought management plan, at least in mind right now, for the potential of this accelerating further.
Absolutely. It's always a challenge to sort of accept the reality that drought might force us to do some things. I think to producers with their natural optimism and so on, sort of think, well, all we need is, one good rain and we can start recovering from this. And that's true. But again, this time of the year is particularly critical. If we don't get that spring growth in those areas that are dry right now, then all of a sudden you get into serious challenges in your operation or in that region very, very quickly. And so I think, making a drought plan early, one that identifies realistically what your resources available are, what your feasible timelines are, before certain decisions have to be made, or perhaps a sequence of decisions, and have that plan in place to help guide you, because obviously these things tend to turn kind of emotional for producers. It's hard to kind of pull the trigger when something has you under this much stress and so on. And so having a thought-out plan ahead of time, having some dates in mind when decisions have to be made, can really be a help to get producers through this, not only to survive the drought immediately, but also to make sure we don't do things that have longer-term financial and animal consequences, depending on how we manage our way through the current drought.
It's an important message as producers are nearing that time of spring turnout. We're still weeks away from that, but not all that long from now, so they can recalculate on a lot of these things, stocking rates, etc. But looking at it from the broader cattle market perspective then, will we see impacts on prices widely from this drought? Some of these drought issues tend to be somewhat localized. So is that enough to, in the aggregate, influence prices, Derrell?
Well, that's one of the big questions right now, and that's certainly something that producers that might be affected need to keep in mind, is not only what I might have to do, and ultimately that might involve liquidating some or all of your animals, but then also to be prepared for the idea that if this is a bad enough event over a big enough area, particularly in regions where there are a lot of cattle, then we can start to see those broader market impacts. And so we had drought much of last year in parts of the West where, honestly, animal densities are not high enough to really create that volume of total movement that has big impacts on the market. Again, it does have impacts locally, and you certainly don't want to minimize the impact on producers, but in terms of aggregate market impacts. But when you combine those regions that have been in drought for some time with these new areas that could get into serious drought, we have a much greater potential, I think, for those broader market impacts this spring than we have had over the past few months.
Bears watching, obviously. Derrell, as always, your input appreciated. We'll talk again in a few weeks. Many thanks to you.
You're very welcome.
He is livestock economist Derrell Peel out of Oklahoma State University, and he's along with us regularly to talk the cattle market trends here on Agriculture Today.
Kansas farmers and ranchers are helping feed your family in the world. The largest contributor to the Kansas economy is beef cattle. How do you get that juicy steak on your plate? In order for you to enjoy your tasty meal, it requires the hard work of the producers, marketers, advertisers, processors, inspectors, transporters, packers, and consumers. So thank all these people and sit back, relax, and enjoy your tasty meal.
This is Agriculture Today. I'm Jeff Wickman. The most recent BCI Cattle Chat podcast focuses on weed management in pastures and grazing management. Hosts of the program, K-State veterinarians Brad White and Bob Larson, along with clinical assistant professor with the Beef Cattle Institute, Philip Lancaster, covered those topics with K-State Extension weed management specialist Sarah Lancaster. Just like any management decision, she says the first thing to think about when managing weeds in the pasture is to determine your goal.
So if I have someone who calls with a question and they're trying to grow, high quality hay for a specific market, I'm going to give them some different weed management advice than I'm going to be somebody who's just trying to carry over mama cows on their piece of pasture, right? So different levels of input are appropriate for those two different really levels of outcome or levels of revenue that you're going to get off of those management systems. I kind of tongue-in-cheek a lot of times say that how you manage your cattle, that's your best weed management tool as far as managing weeds in pastures. Avoiding overgrazing is really critical because, the name of the game here is to try to keep your forage, your desired species, as healthy and as competitive as you can. So you don't want it run down because then that's when you open up those opportunities for those weeds to come in. Weeds are super fascinating. They're opportunistic little critters that, will take advantage of those weak spots in your pasture to come in and get established.
You bring up overgrazing, and I think that's certainly something that we talk about. And Philip, I know you've done some things looking at that. And as you look from a nutritionist perspective, I would say that's one of our more common issues is overgrazing.
Oh, yeah, most definitely. We tend to take off more than we should. because we're trying to get as much productivity out of that pasture as we can as far as cow numbers and calf weight and things like that. But we may be shooting ourselves in the foot a little bit that we got to turn around and spend however much money per acre to control the weeds because we tried to pull too much pounds of calf off of that pasture.
Are there soil conditions that make it worse for weeds, or is it pretty similar?
Soil conditions definitely matter. If you think about what you're doing is grazing, Phil was talking about extracting those pounds of calf from your pasture, right? Well, what's going with that pound of calf? That muscle is a lot of nitrogen, right? Protein, nitrogen, and inputs that have to be returned back to the soil or maintained in the soil. So, if you get behind, especially on pH management, I think sometimes soil pH is sort of a forgotten management practice. It changes relatively slowly over time, so it's easy to kind of miss that. But really what we're thinking about is managing. So
you're saying we should do a soil test in the pasture? Is that an annual? Is that every 5 years? How often should I do that?
Yeah, good question. So soil testing, something like every 3 to 5 years is probably a good thing to shoot for. And as far as like how to soil sample, just making sure you're getting a representative soil sample. It doesn't take a ton of soil cores from 12-ish to 15-ish maybe locations for really most pasture sizes, as long as, again, you've got kind of a representative land area. If you have big differences in topography within your pasture, you might want to kind of create some sections there. But yeah, you're looking at pulling soil cores, and how deep you want to pull those cores, Brad, actually depends on which lab you're going to use. So some labs provide recommendations back to the land manager in terms of a 6-inch soil depth, and some do an 8-inch soil depth. So you really need to coordinate with the lab that you're going to send to know some of the specifics about how deep to pull those cores, how they want them packaged and sampled. The other thing is, thinking about when you're going to pull those, because you've got to give yourself enough lead time to get them to the lab, get them processed, and get your results back in time to have a timely fertilizer application.
How different is my strategy in controlling some of those weeds?
So there's a couple things to think about from my perspective in terms of, what are you looking at for your weeds? Some weeds actually have relatively high nutritive value. There was some work done by the weed scientists at Mizzou that looked at palatability and nutritional quality of weeds, like common ragweed, for example, have actually pretty decent nutritional value. So again, if you're grazing cattle, probably a little bit of common ragweed isn't going to hurt. So common ragweed is an example of a warm season annual plant. So you got to know when that plant is going to grow. So is it warm season or cool season? So if you have an infestation of a cool season weed, you're going to want to control that earlier versus a warm season weed that's going to come on. So season of growth and then annual. So does that plant restart from seed every year? Or is it a perennial? Is that plant going to regrow from rhizomes or from some sort of root or overwintering structure every year? Because you got to think about those two situations differently, right? So your annuals you can get rid of a little faster generally. Perennials are a totally different story. You got to kill the root. And so that affects application timing there. So typically we think about more fall types of herbicide applications for those perennials so that we can kill the roots.
We're thinking about weeds, but right now it is that time of year. The grass is just starting to green up. Philip, I want to ask you first because, we're ready to turn cows out and the grass is still relatively short, but there's enough out there for them to pick around on. How patient do I have to be? Because that's not really in my skill set.
Not yet. Don't do it. So, and we see green grass and we think, all right, no more of this hay feeding. Just let them go, graze it themselves. But from a plant physiology perspective, we're talking about a perennial grass plant that's growing back from the roots. It's using its winter stores to grow those first leaves. And if we let those cows go out there and graze off those first leaves, then it doesn't have any leaf area to create new food from photosynthesis. And so you're going to actually hurt your overall forage production through the whole grazing season by grazing it off too soon in the spring. And so we need to hold those cattle off, or at least get them into your rotational grazing system immediately. so that you're going to graze on this one for a very short amount of time, a day, maybe even less than a day, and then moving to the next one so that grass has a chance to get that leaf material growing and start photosynthesizing some new food so it can keep going.
You talked about the within season effects, but I think it's interesting to think about the over time effects, right? Like in Kansas, a lot of our brome grass stands are 20, 30 or more probably years old. And so one of the questions that I've gotten multiple times in the year that I've been here is about foxtail control, which is a warm season grass in these brome pastures. And so, we've looked at some herbicide answers and we're doing some research on that perspective, but really a colleague of mine pulled up an old, I think like 1967, I think was the date on this publication out of West Virginia, talking about brome grass stands over time. They were looking at haying, not so much grazing, but if you hay that stuff too soon, over like 5 years, you dramatically reduce the productivity of that stand. And so, there's a lot of things that we do that maybe we don't see the negative impact of this year. But if you look back 10 years from now and you've got a problem, it was probably building incrementally over time.
You have a benchmark, and I know it differs by grass type, how much forage you want out there before you're ready to turn cattle out?
So yeah, it definitely depends on grass type. So some of our introduced grasses, we can graze them down to a stubble height of like 3 to 4 inches. So, you probably want 6 or so inches of new grass out there before you let them start grazing on it. Our natives, we need to leave like 6 inches of stubble height. So they need to be 8 to 10 inches tall before you start grazing on them hard. It's hard, but you're better off to hold off on turning the cows out in the long run.
Well, and I think your point is also good, and we'll see there'll be selective grazing. And Sarah talked earlier about some of the different weeds that they will eat and some of the weeds that they won't eat. And depending on where they are in the pasture, trying to get a uniform graze across depends on your pasture size, configuration, where the water is, how the cattle are going to move around. So you have to look at how can I try to manage that. And you don't go until the entire pasture is at that height level that you're talking about, Philip, or there'll be parts of it that'll be down to the dirt. Cattle will eat while they're out there. That's their job. And I think that brings up a good question because you talked about native versus introduced pastures. And I know, Bob, you had a question on that.
What is the proper way to look at weed control? Are weeds bad? Are they medium? Confirm for me or help me understand the differences in different situations.
I kind of let off with this, right, Bob? It depends on your goals. And we have very different goals a lot of time. Well, think about nature and nature's goals, biology. We have an introduced pasture, something like a brome grass or something that we want a monoculture in there. We established that single species planting, and that's what we want to keep, right? Especially, think about some of the weeds we do want to get rid of, the thistles we've talked about, right? Like those can cause physical injury to cows. Some weeds are poisonous. If the cows will eat it and it's not going to hurt them, or if it's not invasive, maybe, especially in a native situation, maybe herbicides aren't always necessary.
That's K-State Extension Weed Management Specialist Sarah Lancaster. She was a recent guest on the BCI Cattle Chat podcast, which is produced by the Beef Cattle Institute at Kansas State University. To listen to the entire podcast, visit ksubci.org. Agriculture Today is back after the break. This is the K-State Radio Network.
When a thunderstorm approaches, follow these safety tips. Lightning, known as the underrated killer, usually strikes the tallest objects, so avoid standing beneath trees or other isolated tall objects. Take shelter in a sturdy building. Remember, if you're close enough to hear thunder, you're close enough to be struck by lightning. Help keep you and your family safe this severe weather season. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
Broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you, and on we go now to today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, last week, the states of Iowa, Nebraska, Illinois, Michigan, South Dakota, Minnesota, Oregon, and Virginia put out a statement saying that small refinery exemptions to the renewable fuel standard have hurt their states and the biofuel industries in their states. They said that this guts the RFS, as they put it, rendering it ineffective in creating demand for renewable fuel. And without the demand created by the standard, the renewable fuel industry, they say, will continue to suffer substantial economic harm. From 2016 to 2018, the states say, exemptions reduced the RFS mandate by an average of 7% each year, causing more than $2 billion in lost demand for renewable fuel each year. The state said that dialing back on the RFS also harms the environment and energy independence. Now, in Iowa, according to this brief, the renewable fuel industry accounted for about $4 billion, or 2% of that state's gross domestic product in 2020. From 2010 to 2017 in Nebraska, the biofuels industry contributed from 3,500 to 4,900 jobs each year, as said in the statement. In 2020, the U.S. industry had an estimated $34.7 billion effect on the GDP, according to this brief. Refining interests argued in their brief to the Supreme Court that if the 10th Circuit Court decision is upheld, small refineries likely would be unable to qualify for exemptions going forward. Growth Energy and the American Farm Bureau Federation filed an amicus brief on Wednesday in which they argued small refinery exemptions are meant to be rare. The National Trade Estimates Report on Foreign Trade Barriers, issued by the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, covers 61 countries, the European Union, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the Arab League among them. Not surprisingly, China occupies 35 pages of the 570-page report, with several notations on the Phase 1 agreement between the U.S. and China. That agreement also includes a commitment by China to make substantial additional purchases of U.S. goods and services in calendar years 2020 and 2021, the report notes. Importantly, the Phase 1 agreement establishes a strong dispute resolution system that ensures prompt and effective implementation and enforcement. Since the entry into force of the agreement in February of last year, the U.S. continues to engage China as issues arise and will continue to monitor developments closely. The report noted several areas relative to agriculture where progress has been made, but still concluded that China remains a difficult and unpredictable market for U.S. agricultural exporters, largely because of inconsistent enforcement of regulations and selective intervention in the market by China's regulatory authorities. The failure of China's regulators to routinely follow science-based international standards and guidelines further complicates and impedes agricultural trade, says the report. It also focused on China's overcapacity in several areas, their intellectual property rights actions, technology transfers, and more. The President's infrastructure plan calls for affordable broadband for everyone, including those who live in rural America. With a look at that, the USDA's Gary Crawford.
Millions of Americans, though, lack access to reliable high-speed internet, including more than 35% of rural America.
President Biden unveiling his infrastructure plan. In that plan, one objective:
make sure every single American has access to high-quality, affordable, high-speed internet.
And we have been putting this off for far too long.
Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack told us
the president's plan basically says, look, if we're going to be serious about economic opportunity in all parts of the country, if we're going to be serious about equity and making sure that persistently poor areas of the country are brought up to speed, we're going to have to invest in broadband, and we're going to have to invest in the broadband that gives people the same advantage regardless of where they live.
Vilsack says, as far as he's concerned,
we have to be serious about this, and we have to invest serious resources in this effort.
And what are serious resources?
Tens of billions of dollars, as the president's plan outlines.
Billions over the next 7 years. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Some items here from the agricultural calendar. If you are a commercial pesticide applicator, still short some hours to renew your 2020 applicator license, or you just want to get credits to renew for this year. If your license expired during the COVID state disaster emergency, it shall remain valid until 90 days following the termination of the emergency declaration. Now, the Kansas State Pesticide Safety Program and K-State Research and Extension are providing a training opportunity this month for several of the categories to help those that need to renew. This training will be offered in a virtual format via Zoom. There will be the only trainings offered by the program this spring. In order to hold the training, they must have at least 20 registered participants. The training dates in the categories: April the 21st and 22nd on rights of way, industrial weed control, noxious weed control. Then April the 28th and the 29th on forestry, ornamental, turf, and interior scape weed control. And then on April the 30th on agricultural plant control. Training information is available online. You can check with Franny Miller at K-State, F. Miller at ksu.edu to have the flyer emailed to you to find out more about these commercial pesticide training sessions coming up this month. And the Kansas Range Youth Camp for this year is all lined out, a program that's been going for well over 50 years now. If you know of an eligible student interested in ranching, natural resources, or wildlife, please share this information with them to attend this educational event. It's like none other in Kansas. It is coming up June the 15th through the 18th at Camp Minnesca in Kingman County. Upon the upcoming sophomore, junior, and senior high school years, students are eligible to attend and learn range plant identification, plant growth, stocking rate determinations, livestock nutrition, rangeland wildlife management, and much, much more. Now, the spots for this camp fill up quickly, so get signed up as soon as possible. The registration deadline is May the 15th. Any interested students should contact their local conservation district or extension offices for more information. The registration deadline, again, is May the 15th, and it'll include field trips, a steak dinner, various activities such as swimming, canoeing, fishing, and hiking. It's a great event. The annual Kansas Range Youth Camp, sponsored by the Kansas Section Society for Range Management, with support from K-State Research and Extension. Check that out. We'll hand it back over now to Jeff Wickman after the break for this week's 4-H segment. That's coming right up. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
You're listening to Agriculture Today. I'm Jeff Wickman. The Kansas 4-H Pledge includes pledging my hands to larger service. Southeast Area Kansas 4-H specialist Beth Hinshaw says that now is a good time for youth to plan and begin working on their community service projects. Beth, I think everybody is feeling like spring has finally arrived and is maybe here to stay. And as we move forward, it's an opportunity for youth to start thinking about and maybe even participating in some of those community service ideas.
Yes. You know, Jeff, community service is one of those things that our young people in 4-H, they look back on that and they can remember those activities that they completed with their friends and, with their fellow club members. And so in addition to just the community service aspect of it, we have a real opportunity, I feel like, in 4-H to really move toward that service learning piece of not just doing the service, but, really helping young people understand why that's important, why that's needed, what's happened in your community to make that needed. So really helping them have a learning experience at the same time.
And because we've been isolated for more than a year now, this might also be an opportunity as we have a chance to do a little bit more interaction, to get together and do something safely, but to get out there and really tackle a project.
Yes, and so many of our projects in the spring are outdoors because the weather is nicer. And I think this spring we are ready to get back outside and to be doing some things. And we know there's plenty of things in communities all across Kansas that could be done.
Is this something that most of the groups do themselves as one club, or do they sometimes join forces and work on a community project together?
I think we really see both of those things. Sometimes there's maybe something going on in a community, and so a bunch of 4-H clubs might jump in and be a part of it. And then we have other 4-H clubs that maybe they have a service type thing that they do every year. When I was out in Ellis County, I know we had a 4-H club that every year right before Memorial Day would mow the cemeteries because they knew people would be coming to their small rural community looking for graves, and that was a way that they could make that easier for those people to find. And so, that was an annual type of service project that group did.
And this is something that the clubs decide on themselves? They probably talk about it at some of their meetings?
Yes, and, there's kind of 5 steps to community service, and one of them is picking a project by determining what some needs are in your community. And I think it's really important to let young people brainstorm about what is it that they're seeing that is an issue or needs to be done. It might be things that they're seeing in their community. It might be things they've heard from the news. And it might even give them an opportunity to research or, to follow up on some of those things. So picking that project is probably the number one piece. Number 2 is to plan your project, and certainly we hope that they'll get some partners involved with them and let people know what it is that they want to do. That might help get some publicity, or it might help get some partners to take part as well. And then definitely we want to do whatever that service project is, get as many people in our 4-H club to take part. And then the piece that I think makes this really educational, in addition to brainstorming and doing that research at the front, is to really take time to reflect on, what was the difference that doing this service project did in your community? Why was that important? What did you learn from that? And what would you do differently next time? It's very much like the experiential learning model that we talk about with 4-H project learning. And then, of course, the last part of this would be, to celebrate that you did it. Take time to celebrate any time you finish a project.
Well, I know sometimes farmers and ranchers and youth in general are a little bit hesitant in rural communities to toot their own horn, but that's kind of one of the things that they also need to do is share what they've done, and they can do that through social media very easily.
Most definitely. And we know that there are lots of people who would like to be involved in their community, and this is a wonderful way for people in our community to see what 4-H is all about and want their children to be involved with this type of activity as well. So I think not only does it give good recognition to the 4-H program, but it really helps us get our message out there. Part of our 4-H pledge is we pledge our hands to larger service in our community. And so what a great way to not just say the pledge, but to have people actually see how that is happening.
And this is different than some of the organized ones we have where we do like the 48 hours and things like that. This is just something that they do each year?
Yes, and, we certainly love it when clubs take part in our 48 Hours of 4-H service program, and that's always in October. And this year will be October 9th and 10th. But we know that 4-H clubs, I would say most of them have 2 to 4 service things that they do every year. Some kind of project that maybe just came up, or maybe something, again, like I mentioned earlier, it's something annual that they do.
So this may be something they do for cleaning up a park. It could be something they do for senior citizens. A lot of options, and that's really why they need to go through that planning stage.
Yes, going through that stage to begin with, to really think about what is needed in your community, I think really makes it meaningful service. The other thing, we talk about the project pathway and, moving yourself along a project pathway to possible careers. I think there's a lot of things that we can learn in our community when we're researching the kinds of things that need to be done. What does it mean to be a city commissioner or a county commissioner? What are some of these different kinds of groups and organizations that we're interacting with to plan our service project, and what kind of career is that resource person has? I just think there's lots of different things that we can learn.
And a good opportunity for the older youth to work with the younger youth and even some people from the community.
Yeah, most definitely. We know service projects offer us lots of partnership activities and a chance for leadership within the group. Oftentimes those older youth can lead a group of younger youth through some part of the service activity.
You mentioned the 5 steps that they can go through. Can they find those online?
Definitely. And you find a lot of this information at our 48 Hours of 4-H site. As we said, 48 Hours of 4-H is it's a project that we do in October, but there is a whole planning guide that would help a club do any kind of service project, whether they plan it for that October time frame or not.
That's Southeast Area Kansas 4-H specialist Beth Hinshaw. For more information about community service projects, visit kansas4h.org. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. Along with Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.